The
These
ring that
spirits will serve
haunted
my
him for
purpose.
As you
centuries.
command, my lord.
The
See that
night
they are
was thick
potent.
with the kind of darkness that seemed to
Eternally
swallow
bound.
every trace of
In
light.
darkness
And the
light.
ancient city of Valdraheim had not seen a storm like
You may
this
now
in over
exchange your
300
vows.
years,
With this ring I
which
do
made
wed.
the
And with
thunder
this ring?
rolling across the sky feel like an
These
ominous
spirits will
warning from the
serve my
heavens
purpose.
As you
themselves.
command, my lord.
Deep
See that they
within
are
the
potent.
obsidian tower that rose above the city like a
Eternally
blade
bound.
piercing the
In
clouds,
darkness
Lord
light.
Kael Varenthos sat upon his throne of black marble and
You may now
bone.
exchange your
His
vows.
crimson
With
eyes
this
fixed
ring I do
upon the
wed.
window
And with
as
this ring?
lightning illuminated the endless rain that
These
battered against
spirits
the
will serve
glass
my
with a
purpose.
fury that
As you
matched the
command, my lord.
turmoil brewing
See
in
that
his
they are
cold,
potent.
immortal heart. He was
Eternally
the
bound.
vampire king,
In
a
darkness
creature who had
light.
walked this earth for over 800 years, who had watched
You may
empires
now
rise and
exchange your
crumble to
vows.
dust,
With
who had
this ring I
loved
do
and
wed.
lost
And
more
with this
times
ring?
than any mortal could comprehend.
These
And yet on this
spirits will serve
particular
my
evening,
purpose.
As you
something
command,
stirred
my
within
lord.
him that he had
See
not
that they are
felt in
potent.
centuries. A restlessness that made
Eternally
his
bound.
ancient blood sing
In
with
darkness
anticipation
light.
and dread in equal measure. His
You may
advisors
now
had told him
exchange
that
your
the human
vows.
world had
With this
changed
ring I do wed.
dramatically
And
since he
with
had
this
last
ring?
walked among them, that the mortals now carried devices in their pockets that connected them to all the knowledge of their kind, that they had built cities that scraped the very sky, and that they no longer feared the darkness the way they once had. But Kael had dismissed their reports with a wave of his pale hand, for he had grown tired of the endless cycle of watching humanity evolve while he remained frozen in time, unchanging. Unaging and increasingly alone, the other vampires in his court feared him too much to offer genuine companionship, and the human servants who attended to his needs during the daylight hours looked upon him with barely concealed terror in their trembling eyes, so he had retreated further and further into isolation, until the loneliness had become a second skin that he wore as comfortably as his black silk robes. But tonight was different. Tonight the council had demanded his presence at the annual masquerade ball that served as the vampires' most sacred gathering, a tradition that stretched back to the founding of their kind, and though Kael had considered refusing, he knew that his absence would be seen as weakness, and a vampire king could never afford to appear weak, not when there were always ambitious lords and ladies waiting in the shadows to seize his throne and claim his power for themselves. So he had descended from his tower, stepped into the waiting carriage that would carry him through the rain-soaked streets, and allowed himself to be transported to the grand ballroom of the Crimson Palace, where hundreds of vampires in elaborate costumes and masks had gathered to celebrate another year of their eternal existence. The moment he entered the ballroom, every conversation ceased, every pair of eyes turned toward him, and even the orchestra paused mid-note before quickly resuming their haunting melody. Because Kael Varenthos was not simply a king, he was a legend made flesh, a creature so ancient and powerful that even other vampires spoke his name in whispers, and his presence commanded a respect that bordered on religious reverence. He wore no mask, for he had nothing to hide and no one would dare question his choice, and his black armor gleamed in the candlelight as he walked through the crowd, the sea of vampires parting before him like waves retreating from the shore. It was then that he saw her, standing alone near the grand fountain that dominated the center of the ballroom, and the sight of her stopped him cold in his tracks, his centuries of practiced composure shattering like glass in a single heartbeat. She was human, that much was immediately clear from the warmth of her blood that he could sense pulsing through her veins. But she was unlike any human he had ever encountered, dressed entirely in black lace and velvet that clung to her form like shadows made solid, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders in waves that seemed to absorb the light around her, and her eyes lined with dramatic black paint that made them appear almost supernatural, met his gaze with an intensity that no mortal had ever dared to display in his presence. She was what the humans of this era called a goth, he realized, a member of a subculture that embraced the darkness and found beauty in the macabre, and he found himself strangely fascinated by her fearlessness, her refusal to cower before him like every other human had done throughout his long existence. But it was not her beauty or her boldness that had frozen him in place, though both were remarkable in their own right. It was the ring she wore on the fourth finger of her left hand, a ring that he recognized instantly despite the centuries that had passed since he had last seen it. A ring of ancient silver shaped like a serpent swallowing its own tail, with two tiny rubies serving as its eyes that seemed to glow with an inner fire that had nothing to do with the candlelight. That ring had belonged to him once, a very long time ago, and he had given it to a young woman on the night he had promised to marry her, the night before his entire world had been destroyed and his humanity had been ripped away from him forever. Her name had been Alina, and she had been the daughter of a simple blacksmith in a village that no longer existed, a girl with kind eyes and a gentle spirit who had seen past his cold exterior to the lonely man beneath. And she had loved him not for his wealth or his status, but for the person he truly was inside, a rare and precious gift that he had treasured more than all the gold in his family's coffers. They had planned to marry in the spring, when the flowers would bloom and the birds would sing and the whole world would celebrate their union. But fate had other plans for Cale Varenthos, because on the eve of their wedding, a vampire had attacked his village, had slaughtered everyone he loved, including his parents and his younger siblings, and had transformed him against his will into the very monster he now was. He had searched for Alina in the aftermath of that terrible night, had wandered through the burning ruins of his village calling her name until his voice gave out and the sun forced him to seek shelter. But he had never found her body, had never known whether she had escaped or whether she had perished in the flames, and that uncertainty had haunted him for 800 years. A wound that never healed because it never received the closure that would allow it to scar over and fade with time. And now, impossibly, the ring he had given her was here, wrapped around the finger of a young woman who could not possibly be his Alina, because Alina had been mortal and would have died centuries ago. And yet the resemblance was so striking that Cale felt as though he had been transported back in time to that small village where he had known true happiness for the first and last time in his existence. The young woman seemed to sense his attention, and she turned to face him fully, her dark painted lips curving into a smile that held no fear, only curiosity and something else, something that looked almost like recognition, as though she too felt the strange connection that crackled between them like electricity before a storm. She began walking toward him, her long black skirt trailing behind her like the train of a queen's gown, and with each step she took, Cale's dead heart seemed to beat faster, which should have been impossible because his heart had not beat since the night of his transformation, and yet there it was, a faint flutter in his chest that grew stronger as she drew closer. She stopped directly in front of him, so close that he could smell the perfume she wore, something dark and sweet like night-blooming flowers, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, carrying the weight of words that had been waiting centuries to be spoken. She looked up at him with those fearless eyes, and she said the words that would change everything, the words that would unravel 800 years of carefully constructed walls and force him to confront a past he had tried desperately to forget. She held up her hand, displaying the serpent ring in all its ancient glory, and she said simply, "I have been waiting for you, my Lord Cale, and I believe you made me a promise once, a promise that you never had the chance to keep, and I have crossed time itself to remind you of that promise, and to give you the choice you were never given that night when everything was stolen from us." The vampire king, who had faced armies and demons and gods without flinching, felt his knees go weak, and for the first time in 8 centuries, he did not know what to do or say next, because standing before him was either the answer to every prayer he had whispered in the darkness of his lonely nights, or the most elaborate trap ever designed to destroy him. The truth behind the ring. The silence that followed her words stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss, fragile and trembling, and every vampire in the ballroom had stopped pretending to ignore their king and was now openly staring at the scene unfolding before them, because never in the long history of their kind had anyone addressed Lord Cale Varenthos with such familiarity, such intimacy, and such complete absence of fear. The young woman stood her ground, her chin lifted in quiet defiance, her eyes never leaving his face as she waited for him to respond. And in that moment, Cale saw something in her gaze that made his cold blood run colder still, a knowledge that ran deeper than anything a mortal should possess, a knowledge of things that had happened before her great-great-grandmother's grandmother had been born. When he finally found his voice, it emerged as a whisper, rough and cracked from emotions he had forgotten he could feel, and he asked her how she knew his name, how she came to possess that ring, and what sorcery or treachery had brought her to this place on this night of all nights, because he was too old and too wise to believe in coincidences. And the appearance of this woman wearing Alina's ring could only mean that someone was trying to manipulate him, to use his greatest weakness against him. to finally bring down the vampire king who had ruled unchallenged for so many centuries. But the young woman only smiled, and there was sadness in that smile, the kind of sadness that comes from carrying a burden too heavy for a single lifetime. And she reached into the small bag that hung from her shoulder and withdrew a leather-bound journal so old that its pages were yellowed and crumbling at the edges. And she held it out to him like an offering, explaining that this journal had been passed down through her family for generations, that it contained the truth about who she was and why she was here. And that if he would only read it, he would understand everything. Cale took the journal with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to maintain his composure. And when he opened it, he found himself looking at handwriting he recognized instantly. Handwriting that had once filled love letters he had treasured more than gold. Handwriting that belonged to Alina, his Alina, the woman he had loved and lost before his humanity was stripped away. The first entry was dated 2 days after the attack on their village, and as Cale began to read, the ballroom around him seemed to fade away, until there was nothing in the world but him and the words on the page and the young woman who waited patiently for him to discover the truth. Alina had survived the attack, the journal revealed. She had hidden in the root cellar beneath her father's forge when the vampire came, had listened in silent terror as the screams of everyone she loved echoed through the night. And when dawn finally came and the monster retreated, she had emerged to find her entire world reduced to ashes and corpses. She had searched for Cale among the dead, had desperately hoped to find him wounded but alive. But when she could not find his body anywhere, she had been forced to accept that he had been taken, transformed into the very creature that had destroyed their lives. And she knew that if she ever saw him again, he would not be the man she had loved, but something else entirely. The journal continued, chronicling Alina's journey as she fled the ruins of her village and made her way to a distant city where no one knew her name, where she could start over and try to build a new life from the rubble of the old one. She married eventually, not for love but for survival, because a young woman alone in that brutal world had few options, and she had children who grew up hearing stories of a love so pure that it had defied the very forces of darkness, even if only for a little while. But Alina never forgot Cale, never stopped loving the man he had been, and on her deathbed she made her descendants promise that they would keep his rings safe, that they would pass down her story from generation to generation, and that if Cale ever came looking for her, they would tell him the truth about what had happened and remind him that he had once been capable of great love, that beneath the monster he had become, the heart of a good man still beat. Cale's hands were shaking badly now, and when he looked up from the journal, he saw that the young woman's eyes were glistening with unshed tears, and he realized that she had not come here to trap him or manipulate him. She had come here to fulfill a promise that her ancestor had made 800 years ago, a promise that had been kept through wars and plagues and countless generations. A chain of devotion that stretched across centuries, simply because one woman had loved one man enough to believe that love was worth preserving even beyond death. Her name was Maya, she told him, and she was Alina's descendant, the latest in a long line of women who had been raised on stories of the vampire king and his lost love, women who had been taught from birth that their family had a sacred duty to fulfill. And when she had turned 25 years old, the same age Alina had been when the attack occurred, she had felt an inexplicable pull toward the supernatural world, had begun researching vampires and their history, had eventually discovered that the annual masquerade ball was real and not just legend, and had done whatever was necessary to gain entry, because she knew in her heart that this was the moment her entire family line had been building toward, the moment when she would finally meet the man her ancestor had loved. The vampires in the ballroom were whispering now, their ancient eyes flicking between their king and the mortal woman who had captured his attention so completely, and Cale could sense their confusion and their curiosity, and in some cases their anger because a vampire king showing such obvious emotion for a human was unprecedented and potentially dangerous, a sign of weakness that his enemies would surely try to exploit. But Cale did not care about politics or power in that moment. He cared only about the woman standing before him, this Maya who carried Alina's blood in her veins and Alina's love in her heart, this brave young woman who had walked into a den of monsters simply to deliver a message from someone who had died centuries before she was born. He asked her what she wanted, what reward she expected for bringing him this truth, because in his experience, everyone wanted something and no one did anything purely out of kindness or devotion. But Maya shook her head and said that she wanted nothing except for him to know that he had been loved, that Alina had forgiven him for becoming what he had become, and that she had died hoping that someday he would find his way back to the light. Even if that light was only a candle in the endless darkness of his immortal existence. But before Cale could respond, before he could process the storm of emotions raging inside him, a cold voice cut through the whispers of the crowd, and Lord Victor Draven, the most ambitious and ruthless of Cale's rival lords, stepped forward with a cruel smile on his pale face, declaring that this was clearly a trick designed to destabilize the vampire court, that the human woman was obviously a spy or an assassin, and that she should be executed immediately as a warning to anyone else who might try to infiltrate their sacred gathering. Several vampires moved to seize Maya, their fangs extended and their eyes glowing with hunger, and Cale felt something shift inside him, something that had been dormant for 8 centuries roaring back to life with terrible fury. And before he knew what he was doing, he had placed himself between Maya and the advancing vampires, his voice echoing through the ballroom like thunder as he declared that anyone who touched her would answer to him personally, and that he would consider any attack on her to be an attack on him and his throne. The vampires froze, their predatory instincts warring with their fear of their king, and Victor's smile faltered for just a moment before returning even whiter than before. Because he had seen what he needed to see, he had found the vampire king's weakness after centuries of searching, and now he knew exactly how to destroy the most powerful creature in their world. The promise kept. The days that followed the masquerade ball were unlike anything Cale had experienced in his 8 centuries of existence, because for the first time since his transformation, he had something to protect, someone to care about, and the weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Maya had agreed to stay in the Crimson Palace under his protection, not as a prisoner but as an honored guest, and Cale found himself visiting her chambers every evening, listening as she told him stories about Alina's descendants, about the generations of women who had kept the flame of their love alive even when the rest of the world had forgotten that Cale Varenthos had ever been human. She showed him photographs of her family, images captured by human technology that allowed him to see the faces of Alina's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, faces that carried echoes of the woman he had loved so long ago, and with each image, Cale felt another layer of the ice around his heart begin to melt. Maya was nothing like Alina in personality. She was bolder and more outspoken. She laughed loudly and spoke her mind without hesitation, and she had a fierce spirit that reminded him not of his lost love but of his younger sister, who had died in the attack that had taken everything from him. And yet there was something of Alina in her as well, a kindness that shone through her dark aesthetic, a gentleness in the way she looked at him that made him feel seen in a way he had not felt since that fateful night 800 years ago. Victor Draven was not idle during this time, and Cale's spies reported that the ambitious lord was gathering allies, whispering to the other vampires that their king had been compromised, that his attachment to a human would make him weak and indecisive, and that the time had come for new leadership that would restore the vampire court to its former glory. Cale knew that a confrontation was inevitable, that Victor would eventually make his move, but he found that he did not care as much as he once would have, because Maya had reminded him of something he had forgotten, something that had been buried beneath centuries of darkness and loneliness. The simple truth that life, whether mortal or immortal, was meaningless without love. It was Maya who proposed the plan, one evening as they sat together in the palace gardens, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, and her idea was so audacious, so completely unexpected, that Cale could not help but laugh, a genuine laugh that surprised even him because he had not laughed in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like. She suggested that instead of waiting for Victor to attack, instead of playing the political games that vampires had played for millennia, Cale should simply give up his throne, walk away from the power and the politics and the endless scheming, and find a new purpose for his immortal existence. A purpose built not on fear and domination, but on something more meaningful. At first, Kale dismissed the idea as naive, explaining that a vampire king could not simply retire, that his enemies would hunt him to the ends of the earth if he showed such weakness. But Maya pointed out that he had already shown weakness by protecting her, that his reputation for cold invincibility had been shattered the moment he stepped between her and the other vampires, and that trying to rebuild that reputation would require him to become even more cruel and ruthless than he had been before. To destroy any part of himself that was still capable of love or compassion. Was that really what he wanted, she asked, to spend another 800 years alone in his tower, feared by everyone and loved by no one, simply because he was too afraid to take a chance on something different? Her words struck him like a physical blow, because she was right, she was absolutely right. And Kale realized that he had been hiding behind his power and his position for centuries, using them as an excuse to avoid the pain of genuine connection, the risk of opening himself up to loss again. But Maya had shown him that Alina's love had survived for 800 years, had been passed down through generations like a precious heirloom. And if that love could endure for so long, then perhaps he too could endure the risk of loving again, of allowing himself to hope for something more than mere survival. The night of Victor's attack came 3 weeks later, and it was everything Kale had expected and nothing he had prepared for, because Victor had not come alone but had brought an army of vampires loyal to his cause, and they descended upon the Crimson Palace like a wave of darkness, intent on destroying everyone who stood in their way. Kale fought with a fury that he had not displayed in centuries, cutting through his enemies with ancient skill and supernatural strength, but there were too many of them, and he knew that eventually they would overwhelm him, that Victor's patience and scheming had finally paid off. But then something unexpected happened, something that no one could have predicted, because the doors of the palace burst open and a group of humans rushed in. Humans wearing black clothes and dark makeup. Humans who looked like Maya and who carried weapons made of silver and wood, weapons designed specifically to harm vampires. They were the descendants of Alina, Maya explained as she fought alongside Kale, generations of her family who had been preparing for this moment without even knowing it, training in secret and gathering knowledge about vampires, because the stories they had been raised on had taught them not just about love but about protection, about the responsibility that came with knowing the truth. Together, Kale and Maya and her family fought back against Victor's forces, and as the battle raged, Kale found himself fighting not to protect his throne or his power, but to protect the people who had come to his aid, the humans who had risked their lives for him simply because their ancestor had loved him so long ago. And when Victor finally fell, when his ashes scattered across the floor of the Great Hall, Kale looked around at the destruction and the survivors and realized that everything had changed, that he had been given something he never thought he would have again, a family. In the weeks that followed, Kale made good on Maya's suggestion, abdicating his throne and leaving the vampire court to elect a new leader, choosing to walk away from the power he had accumulated over centuries in favor of something more precious, something more human. He and Maya traveled the world together, not as king and subject, but as equals, as friends who were slowly becoming something more. And though Kale knew that she would age and eventually die while he remained unchanged, he no longer saw that as a reason to keep his distance, but as a reason to cherish every moment they had together. On the anniversary of the night they had met, Kale took Maya back to the ruins of his village, to the place where he had proposed to Alina 800 years ago. And there, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, he knelt before her and asked if she would do him the honor of wearing Alina's ring, not as a descendant honoring her ancestor, but as herself, as Maya, the woman who had taught him that love was stronger than time, stronger than death, stronger than the darkness that had consumed him for so long. Maya said yes, and as Kale slipped the serpent ring onto her finger, he felt Alina's presence surrounding them like a warm embrace, a blessing from beyond the grave, a final gift from the woman who had loved him first and had made sure that her love would find him again when he needed it most. The vampire king who had stopped cold at the sight of a ring had found something he never thought he would find again, And as he held Maya in his arms under the light of 1,000 stars, he finally understood that the promise he had made so long ago had been kept, not in the way he had expected, but in a way that was even more beautiful, a love story that had taken 800 years to complete but was only just beginning.